My recording and share my slides. Maybe. Okay. Here we go. So, yeah, use the chat box for questions, and I'll stop a couple times through the presentation. And there will be a recording available online on our webpage and on our YouTube channel. Usually within about a week after the program, we get that up so that you can feel free to go view it again. So, all right, I'm frozen. There we go. Okay. So for those who are not familiar with Wissahickon Trails and might be new to the organization, welcome. For those who have been to a lot of these over the last however many months we're at, welcome back. Good to see you again. We are an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania. We've been around a little over 60 years to protect, really founded to protect the land and the water of the Wissahickon Creek. As an organization, we have protected nearly 1,300 acres of land from development, often in partnership with local municipalities and generous donors that help us protect that land. On that property, we now have 12 nature preserves and 24 miles of trails that are open for you to use. And we encourage you to get out and take a look at what's there. Our new website, wishickontrails.org, has an absolutely amazing interactive map that you can use to figure out the parking for the preserves and what kind of trail there is and distances and all of that kind of stuff. So I encourage you to take a look at that. If you are not a current supporter of our organization, I would encourage you as well to take a deeper dive into our website and look at all of the work that we have going on in the area, and hopefully encourage you to become a supporter. To any supporters that I have on the program tonight, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Without your support, we would not be here. And so it is very crucial that we get as many people to help support the continuation of our mission as possible. So just a quick outline for tonight. I'm going to do just a little bit about overview of salamanders, sort of the who and the what. Talk about what I call lifestyle families. You'll see as we get into this that taxonomy of salamanders is really confusing, and it's sort of easier to group salamanders by their lifestyles than where they might actually fit on a genetic tree from a species perspective. Talk a little bit about the ecological roles of salamanders and why they're important. Also talk about the declines that are happening with salamanders and amphibians in general, and then talk about the monitoring project that we have going on with our organization on 2 of our preserves right now, and to help us understand and use salamanders as sort of a guideline for how well the forest is doing. So that being said, salamanders, let's start at the very beginning. They're amphibians. And so that includes all frogs and toads and all of the salamanders. And amphibians are characterized by having moist, permeable skin, no scales. And in addition, their eggs lack shells. So they all lay eggs to have young, but their eggs all lack shells. They're usually coated with some kind of a gelatinous kind of protective jelly in most cases, but not all. Actually, some look more like what we think of as an egg. They're just actually not enclosed in a shell. The word amphibian is actually derived from an ancient Greek word, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce for you, but it means basically both kinds of life. And this refers to sort of their 2-stage life cycle that most of them have, that involves being in the water and being on land. And they almost all of them sort of follow that basic 2-stage kind of a thing, sometimes in the water and sometimes on land. And we'll get into the specifics of that when we look at some of the actual species of salamanders in our area. Most of them undergo metamorphosis. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the individual species discussions. But so they go through different forms and they look very different as young versus adults. If you think of a tadpole, for a frog that most of us are familiar with, it looks not anything like a frog, and that's very true of a lot of the salamanders as well. And in fact, they mostly look like tadpoles in a large part of their life cycle. Interestingly enough, salamanders are the only amphibians that actually retain their tails as adults. Everybody else has them as one stage of their life cycle, they'll have a tail, but they lose it in their adult form, except the salamanders. They are ectothermic, and we often refer to that as cold-blooded, but it's not really that their blood is cold, it's just that they physically do not have a way to internally control their own body temperature. And so they rely on the environment to either cool themselves down or warm themselves up. So they might bury themselves in the mud or stay underwater to get cold, or they might come out in the sun or come closer up to the surface of the water to harness the sun's rays to warm themselves up. They do actually hibernate in the winter, and they do what we call estivate in the summer, which basically is a way of controlling their environment to protect them from the hot, drying elements in the summertime. So usually in both cases, for hibernation and estivation, they're buried in mud or underwater. A couple other interesting facts about them. The salamanders actually lack chewing teeth. They swallow their prey whole. Some actually do have small teeth that allow them to hold on to their prey, but they can't actually chew it like we would think of using our teeth to chew food. So like a frog with their tongue that, shoots out and captures prey, salamanders can often do the same things, and hunt airborne insects even. A lot of salamanders actually eat a lot of mosquitoes and are very, very beneficial in that respect. In addition, as I said earlier, they have permeable skin, and most of the amphibians, but especially salamanders, have very primitive lungs. So they actually absorb most of their oxygen needs through their skin. And that has, as we'll see, some significant consequences for them in the environment. And it's part of what makes them a good study for the cleanliness of an environment, because if their environmental situations are not clean and they can't get the oxygen that they need around themselves, then they won't be there. So that's part of the reason why we use salamanders as sort of a general guide for the health of the forest. So as I said earlier, taxonomy of salamanders can be really confusing, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but I thought what would be helpful to sort of have an overview. And as I said, we kind of think of things from their lifestyle categories. So we have three general categories: the aquatic salamanders, the semi-aquatic salamanders, and the terrestrial salamanders. So the aquatic ones spend their entire lives in water. The semi-aquatic ones have at least part of their life cycle on land, but the rest in water. And even during their land phase, they tend to stay closer to water, and the water source is usually where they were born. And then the terrestrial ones may still use water for part of their life cycle, but in general, their land-based part of their cycle is far away from water sources in a lot of cases. So the way I've organized this here, and we're not really going to go through every single one of these, but you'll get a glimpse into sort of the general categories here. The boxes in blue, so hellbenders, water dogs, brook salamanders, dusky salamanders, newts, mole salamanders, and lungless salamanders. Pennsylvania has all of those. We don't have all of those in our watershed. And I'll explain why as we go forward, but Pennsylvania does have all of those representative kind of categories in the state. And so the orange boxes down here at the bottom are ones we don't have. And so really quickly, I'm just gonna show you some pictures of those and give you some background, because there's some interesting salamanders in this group. So the first two here in the left-hand column, I can't, with the Latin, it's just not gonna work tonight. The sirens and the amphibians actually are often confused with being snakes or eels. They have really, really small legs. They actually do have legs and toes, but they're lacking hind limbs in most cases. They have really short forelimbs, which you can barely see right here where my pointer is. These guys are mostly in the southeastern part of the United States. The torrent salamanders, they live in cold, fast-moving brooks and streams in coniferous old-growth forests. So think the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest and those areas. There are actually several different species of torrent salamanders, but they're all very small. They're about 2.5 inches from the tip of their nose to what we call their vent, which is where they eliminate their waste, and it's usually sort of at the base of the body, right underneath the beginning of the tail. So excluding the tail, these guys are about 2.5 inches long. So pretty small as far as salamanders are concerned. And then the Pacific giant salamanders, there's actually several different species of these as well. Again, these guys live in Northern California up to British Columbia. And interestingly enough, these guys can actually make noise. So when they're startled, they can sound like a barking dog. Most salamanders are silent all the time, but there are a few species like the Pacific giant salamanders that can actually make noise in certain circumstances. And these guys tend to be a little bit larger, as you can see. So worldwide, there's about 400 species of salamanders, plus or minus a little bit. People sometimes argue about whether a subspecies is a full species or not, which is an argument we're not going to get into tonight. So there's about 150 species in the United States and 22 species in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to go through some representative examples of pretty much all the categories that you see here. And we're going to start with the aquatic salamanders. So I have to talk about the eastern hellbender because even though they are not found in our immediate area, in our watershed, they were actually named the state amphibian of Pennsylvania in 2019. So no discussion of salamanders in Pennsylvania would be complete without a discussion of the eastern hellbender. These guys are also known as the snot otter, the Allegheny alligator, and mud devil. And they are not attractive salamanders at all. You know, it is what it is. But they are big and they are long-lived. They can get over 2 feet in length and weigh about 5 pounds. They are actually America's largest salamander that we have. They can live up to 30 years. They're relatively flat. You can see the head here is relatively flat, which allows it to hide under rocks. And that's where it will spend most of its time. They actually do absorb about 95% of their oxygen through their skin. And it's typically in these wavy little folds that you see along the side of the salamander. It's hard to see when it's out of the water, but in the water, they sort of have these ripply folds of skin that fan out in the water, and that's where they do most of their oxygen transfer. They require extremely clean water, and it needs to be fast moving and cold. And this is one of the reasons why they're not in our area. Our stream and our creek and a lot of the tributaries for our creek, most of it's not particularly fast moving. It's relatively shallow, which means that the water can get relatively warm quickly, especially in the summer. And so it's just not the right conditions in our watershed for these guys to survive. They are much less common in Pennsylvania than they used to be, but they are still here. There are a lot of groups out there in areas like in the Susquehanna watershed that are working very hard to try to protect them and protect their habitat. They are pretty much solitary and nocturnal, so you don't tend to see them very often, although sometimes you can actually see them on the bottom of a creek like this, picture here. But because of the loss of habitat from polluted water and increased erosion in a lot of our creeks, which leads to silt buildup, which changes the composition of the bottom of the stream, they're finding less and less habitat to be in. There's, and additionally, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, there's some bacterial diseases that can affect amphibians, and so that can also affect the hellbenders. They are actually listed on the International Union of Conservation Nature's red list for threatened species. They're listed as near threatened, but in the United States, they're not really protected very well. Excuse me, and there's no special protections in Pennsylvania, despite the fact that we just named them our state amphibian. Hopefully that will continue to change as more and more people learn about them and understand their requirements and work to protect the streams and the watershed areas in which they are actually living now. Another one that we don't have here, mostly out in Western Pennsylvania, is the mudpuppy. These guys get to be, you know, about a foot long, roughly. They live about 11 years in the wild. And the interesting thing about these guys is they retain these external gills for their oxygen exchange. So a lot of aquatic parts of salamanders' life cycle, they have external gills that look just like this. As they transition to the adult form, they lose those, but the mud puppy retains them throughout its adulthood, and that's what it uses for oxygen exchange. It is nocturnal as well, so not frequently seen. And this one, most salamanders are pretty well versed in what they eat. They will eat a wide variety of prey. They are certainly carnivorous creatures, which is odd to think of something so small being a carnivore, but that's exactly what they are. And this guy eats crayfish, small fish, frogs, you know, tadpoles, anything that it can get into its mouth to feed its lifestyle. Next category is the semi-aquatic, and I also categorize these as stream-side salamanders, and you'll see why as we go through. So most semi-aquatic salamanders have a life cycle that looks like this. The eggs are laid underwater, attached to vegetation or under a rock or something like that. The eggs hatch, and you get this aquatic stage water-dwelling larva, which here's the external gills that, like I said, the tail like a tadpole, small little tiny legs, and you know, it stays in the water. And how long it stays in the water depends on the species, and we'll see that in some of the examples. But eventually, that water-dwelling larva will metamorphosize into an adult and become a terrestrial adult land-dwelling salamander, hiding under rocks, logs, leaf litter, usually fairly close to water sources. So streams or creeks, springs, those kinds of things are often where you would find these kind of salamanders on land. But again, usually almost always underneath something. They're still gonna look for protection when they're out on the land and not in the water. So they're going to be under a rock, under logs, and that kind of thing. There's a slightly different semi-aquatic approach that's taken by newts. And these guys are actually water-dwelling adults. So you can see here the water-dwelling adult form of the newt has a tail that looks much like the aquatic versions of the larval stage of salamanders. It doesn't quite have the external gills anymore, but it does. So the adult water-dwelling newts will lay their eggs in the water. They'll go through their their water-dwelling larval stage here. Again, tail like a tadpole. Here's the external gills. These guys then go through metamorphosis into a land-dwelling interim stage, if you will. This is what we call the red eft. If you've ever heard of that, EFT is how it's described. This is often the salamander that you will see walking across the trail. These guys, because of the neurotoxins that they secrete in their skin that are irritating to predators. They're not really a toxin, but they definitely don't taste good. So they tend to be more bold than most other salamanders. So you can often see these guys walking across, you know, a wooded trail along the edge, maybe climbing on top of a log or something like that. You don't have to usually look under things to find them. And after about between 3 to 7 years, they actually wander around on land. They will undergo a second metamorphosis into the water-dwelling adult. And the cycle will start all over again. So they're a little bit different, excuse me, than the other semi-aquatic salamanders. But still, you know, part of the life cycle in the water, part of the life cycle in the land. And so some other examples of semi-aquatic salamanders in our area, northern red is probably one of the more common ones that you might encounter if you're looking for it. Again, under logs, under rocks, near the creek. Sometimes you can actually find the northern red salamanders defending their eggs underneath a rock, you know, right at the edge of the creek, in the water, those kinds of things. These guys are kind of plump. You can see that comparatively to the other species that are on this page. They're kind of big. They can get 4 to 7 inches long, and they actually spend 3 to 4 years in that aquatic larval stage before they transform into the terrestrial adult. So again, another reason why it's really important that we do everything that we can do to keep the waters of the Wissahickon clean, because these guys and other salamanders are living in there, you know, for up to 4 years before that they can become a terrestrial adult and start that reproductive cycle all over again for the next generations. So that clean water is really important. The northern two-line salamander is a slender salamander. It gets its name from the 2 black lines running down its sides. It gets to be about 4 inches long, and these larvae spend about 2 years in the water. The four-toed salamander is a small. This one's only about 2.5 to 3 inches, and unlike the others, they spend only about 8 weeks in the water, so they're pretty short life cycle. It gets the name four-toed because it actually has 4 toes on its hind feet. All other salamanders actually have 5 toes, if you can get a salamander to stand still long enough to count its toes. All the rest of them have 5 toes, except for this one species that has 4. And last but not least, the northern dusky salamander. I just noticed I forgot to write down the size, but I think they're about the same as the northern two-lined, about 4 to 5 inches long, and they spend about a year in the water as the larval stage. All of these salamanders are possible in the watershed. The northern red and the northern two-lined are probably the most commonly encountered, but we have habitat that would support both of these other species, and historically they have been found in Montgomery County in this part of Pennsylvania. So the terrestrial life cycles are a little bit different. Truly terrestrial salamanders have no metamorphosis that occurs. They're the species that fall into this category. They lay their eggs under rocks or fallen logs. The newly hatched young look just like the adults, just miniaturized, and they spend their life cycle just growing to be bigger. But there's another group that's often lumped with terrestrial salamanders that are kind of actually semi-aquatic. Remember, I told you taxonomy is confusing. The main difference between these salamanders that are semi-aquatic and the ones we just discussed, which I talked about as streamside, is their choice of water source and the amount of time that they spend in the water as larvae. So we're going to go through some of the examples. So these guys, even though they're mostly terrestrial, they do lay their eggs in water. They have larvae that have the gill buds. They spend some time in water before they metamorphosize into an adult salamander that spends the rest of its life on land. So just like the other semi-aquatic ones. But you'll see the difference when we look at the examples. So the most abundant salamander by far in the Wissahickon watershed and along the creek and on our preserves is this eastern redback salamander. These guys are pretty small. They're about 4 inches maximum and very slender. They come in 2 color morphs. So the redback here on the bottom, you can see the red stripe down its back. The one on the top here that's guarding its eggs, you can see as well. It's got a sort of red stripe down its back. The amount of red can vary significantly. And then there's also this form that has pretty much no red on its back. We call this the lead form because it kind of looks like the black of a lead pencil, if you will. It also has a lot of little spectacle spots all over it that make it somewhat distinctive from some of the other potentially dark salamanders, like the northern dusky salamander, for example. These guys are the most abundant salamanders that we will find in the watershed. There's no rhyme, no reason to why they're the different color morphs. It's not a sex thing, like it's not all the females are one and all the males are the other. It doesn't seem to be related to environment either. There have been some researchers who have looked to try to see if in certain conditions, like more acidic soil or drier soil or more upland habitats versus closer to water sources, if there's differences in the numbers of the red phase versus the lead phase, and they haven't been able to find anything. So again, these guys are going to hide under rocks, under logs. They will guard their eggs. So sometimes you can find a female salamander sort of protecting her egg clutch. Excuse me. And sometimes when you turn over rocks and logs, you can actually find little teeny tiny eastern redback salamanders. They are the tiniest little things when they're newly hatched. The other 2 semi-aquatic salamanders that we have here are, well, we're going to say terrestrial, but they're sort of semi-aquatic, spotted and marbled. They both use temporary water sources, so vernal pools, those kinds of things, to lay their eggs. They are migratory, so they will return to where they came out of the egg, that vernal pool or that temporary wetland, if you will. They will come back there to breed and lay their eggs as well. And the water part of their cycle tends to be much shorter than the other semi-aquatic species that we discussed. So like maybe the course of 1 summer, that's it. So more like the 4-toed salamander that I said spends only about 8 weeks in the water. They're more like that. They definitely don't spend 3 to 4 years or even a year necessarily as a larval form in the water. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. That's pretty much all I'm going to say on the spotted and marbled, because on October 20th, I'm doing a program specifically on vernal pools, and we're going to talk more about those there, because these are 2 indicator species for having a truly vernal pool. So if you'd like to learn more about them and more about what vernal pools actually are and what they do in the environment, please join us on October 20th, and we'll talk more about the spotted and marbled salamanders there. So I'm going to stop here for questions. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. So there is a question about how far migratory salamanders travel, and it actually depends on the salamander, but we're talking on the order of yards, like hundreds of yards, maybe a couple of miles at most. They don't actually travel very far. And every once in a while, you'll get a few that will travel much further, and they're kind of like the fluky ones, if you will. They're the ones that will go to sort of start a new population in a different area. But for the most part, they don't actually travel very far. We're not talking like when we think of bird migration, you know, and traveling to another continent, or even traveling to states, you know, just to go to Florida and spend the winter or things like that. They don't travel nearly that far at all. And we'll talk more about that in the vernal pool program, because those are the ones that are particularly migratory. There's a question about, can redback salamanders change phases and colors in their lifetime? Not that I'm aware. I believe, just like screech owls that have two different forms, a red form and a gray form, once they're born that way, that's the way they are. What I can tell you, I have noticed some differences between them. And again, I don't know what the significance of this is. I'm going to talk about our monitoring project in a bit, but when you go out to monitor for salamanders and you lift up one of the boards, if there's both kinds under there, the red ones tend to stay put and the lead phase ones are the ones that scurry away faster. And I don't know if that's because the red ones feel slightly more protective. Usually red is a mechanism in nature that says, I'm bad, you know, don't eat me, I won't taste good, I might poison you. And that's not really the case with these guys, but they may sort of be, you know, living on that sort of reputation of red in nature, whereas the darker lead phase ones don't have that protection, so they're much quicker to go try to hide under a leaf or, you know, crawl back under the edge of the log, kind of a thing. Okay, that's all the questions that I see now, but please feel free to put questions in the chat and I will stop again after the next section. So salamanders are keystone species, and the term keystone comes from the name of the essential block, or this wedge in an arch. So this big piece at the top here that basically locks all of the other blocks in place, and it supports the majority of the weight of that arch. And as such, it's the key stone in that archway. Without it, everything would collapse. And ecologists have extended this idea to certain species, which are sort of the glue that holds a habitat together. So if they're removed, it turns the structure and biodiversity of that habitat into something very different. And salamanders actually play that role. There are several broad categories that keystone species can be. Predator species are important. Obviously, you need things to help control all the species below them. But you also need prey species. And interestingly enough, salamanders play both of those roles in the species, in the environment in which they are. They are heavy predators of invertebrates, and they are also a large source of prey for a variety of other species. They're also ecosystem engineers, and we'll talk about that. And so they're incredibly important in the environment. And keystone species, when we talk about it from an ecological perspective, they actually, these kinds of species have a disproportionately large effect on the functioning of their environment relative to their presence or their abundance in that environment. Now, salamanders, interestingly enough, they are the most abundant vertebrate in their ecosystem. There's a number of different studies that have tried to actually estimate the amount of salamanders in a forest, for example, which is where most of the terrestrial ones that we think of, like the eastern redback that we see so much, that's where they're actually living, is in that forest ecosystem. And there's a number of other species that are pretty much the same as the eastern redback salamander that are going to play that same role in their geographic regions that they live. The estimates have ranged anywhere from 3,200 to 9,000 salamanders per hectare. That's per hectare is about 2.5 acres roughly, if that helps you. But the important thing to keep in mind, so 3,200 to 9,000 salamanders per hectare. By comparison, studies show like 16 pairs of birds per hectare in a forest. So we think of birds as being, you know, really numerous and abundant in a lot of the ecosystems in which we encounter them, and they kind of are. Salamanders are like, I don't know, what's that, 40 times the number of birds in an environment and in a specific ecosystem. So they're really, really numerous. And because of that, they play an incredibly important role. They are strong regulators of what happens on the forest floor. So they eat invertebrates, as I showed. And this I borrowed this from the intranets. Because it was the best picture that I could find without having to try to recreate something myself. The spotted salamander here in the middle could be just about any salamander. All of the arrows pointing at the salamander are things that the salamander eats itself. All of the things that are pointing away are things that eat the salamander. So you can see it plays, you know, this important role in the middle of this dynamic ecosystem that includes things on the water like fish and egrets, and water snakes. It also includes a lot of things on land like earthworms and ants and slugs and all of the things that salamanders feast on throughout their lifetime. Larval salamanders are also going to eat eggs of frogs and other salamanders. They're going to eat a lot of the macroinvertebrates that are in the water that we monitor to look and see if water is clean or not. So damselfly and dragonfly larvae are in the water and they will eat those. They will eat cranefly larvae and all of those various macroinvertebrates that are in the water. On the forest end, because of eating slugs and ants and earthworms and things like that, they are really important in maintaining that balance in the forest floor. So a lot of things like slugs and ants and earthworms and snails and other insect invertebrates that are on the forest floor want to decompose all of the leaf litter and other detritus that ends up on the floor of the forest. And that's important. We need that decomposition to happen because that releases minerals and carbon into the soil that the trees need and the other living plants in the forest need. But if too much decomposition happens, then we get erosion, we get, you know, an overabundance of certain kinds of nutrients that may be harmful to things that are living on the forest floor, and we lose moisture. So roots of trees aren't protected as well as they would be if they had that layer of leaves on top of them. And all of the things that live in that leaf litter then do not have a place to live if it's all decomposed too rapidly. So salamanders in the forest play an important role, a very important role of helping to keep that in balance. They want, you know, there's some level of decomposition that needs to happen, but they can't let it get out of hand. And so they're kind of that linchpin in between all of those things that want to decompose everything and keeping some of that decomposition in check. And then from the prey species point of view, salamanders themselves are an important source of prey for birds, small mammals, snakes, fish, turtles, some predatory insects, and other salamanders will prey on them as well. So again, play that sort of pivotal role in the middle of a food web, you know, on both sides as a predator and prey. From an ecosystem engineer point of view, especially the salamanders that live in the forest floor, so like the eastern redback and all of the other terrestrial salamanders that we have in Pennsylvania and across the continent, they burrow underground. And so sometimes they will use burrows from other things that have burrowed underground, like a mouse or a chipmunk or something like that. But a lot of the research has shown that they actually do make their own tunnels and they make their own sort of dens underground. And all of that churning of the soil, again, plays an important role in turnover of minerals and nutrients to the forest itself. And so that's why we think of them as ecosystem engineers for all the tunneling and burrowing that they do underground. And they actually spend a lot of time underground in the heat of the summer. they're nowhere to be found in a forest. They're almost all going to be far underground to stay cool and protected from heat and sunlight so that they can breathe. They need some level of moisture, and they're going to find that moisture further down in the soil during the summertime. And likewise in the winter, again, because they don't want to freeze, they're going to go down further in the soil. And often some of them, especially the terrestrial salamanders, actually don't really hibernate. They may remain active all winter, just further down below the freeze line of the soil. So they're still looking for earthworms and slugs and all of those kinds of things down there to keep them through the winter. So all of that's going to play an important role in keeping that ecosystem of the forest floor healthy. And then they are very much bioindicators. They are very sensitive to changes in the environment. And so they'll show very rapid declines in areas where there's a lot of timber harvest, for example. But they're also indicators of good in the natural areas. So for breeding populations of spotted salamanders specifically are associated with wetlands that have high floral diversity and integrity. So they're really well structured from an ecosystem point of view. You won't find them in wetlands that aren't of good quality, is basically what it comes down to. And so that's one of the ways that, you know, sort of look at the environment as being healthy or not healthy by the salamanders that are there. And typically you will have, particularly on the terrestrial side of things, you will have one salamander species that sort of dominates an area. So like for us, that's the eastern redback. There may be some other ones out there, but by and large, that's the terrestrial salamander that we're going to have. And then we supplement that with a few of the semi-aquatic ones like the northern red and the two-lined, which spend a lot of their time in water, but then as adults, we will find them on land. So just like so many other things in our natural world, salamanders are seeing significant declines. And really, this is more of a sort of a general amphibian kind of threat here. Most estimates, some of the more reliable estimates say that up to 1/3 of all amphibian species are endangered or threatened with extinction. So that's a lot of species around the world. And most of the research has actually been done in frog declines, not so much on salamanders. But I was able to find one paper that showed, and I understand this is a confusing picture, but it's actually relatively easy to understand. Each one of these colors on a graph, this is an area in Mexico, Guatemala. And so it's going up a mountain. So you can see here in this bottom picture, it goes from the tropical forest up to the top of a volcano, an old volcano, and the various species that stratify across that range. But the important thing to look at here is these colored bars in the top graph. They looked at data of encounters from research that was done in the 1970s, and then looked at research comparable to that was done in 2005 and 2007. And measured the mean number of salamanders that were encountered to these various sites that they were looking at. And basically what you can see is, so in the 1970s, all of these big graphs here in the front part of each section were the different species that they found. And you can see fairly high numbers. And again, this is indicative of sort of that idea of one salamander species dominating an area, but fairly high numbers, up to 70, 55-ish, 65-ish maybe here, number of salamanders that were encountered. When they went back and looked at the 2005 to 2007 data, you can see the graphs just fall off, and all these asterisks are species they couldn't find anymore. And so this is only one study, but it's clearly an indication that there's issues in the environment as far as salamanders are concerned. And certainly we know that as far as amphibians are concerned. And a lot of the threats to salamanders are threats that are sort of threats to all amphibian species just because of their lifestyles. So again, like so many other things, we have habitat loss issues. For salamanders specifically, you know, logging and clear cutting of areas for development is going to wipe out that forest habitat. And also a lot of times what happens then is we have cut back, you know, the shaded cover for the streams. And so we change the heat level of the water in the streams, and that impacts the water species as well as the land species when we're clear cutting areas for development or logging and those kinds of things. Anything that fragments the forest is going to have an impact on woodland salamanders. They like things dark, they like things damp, they like areas of old growth forest. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just the Pacific Northwest. Even in areas like we live, older forests tend to have a better canopy cover. They tend to stay cooler in the soil, and they tend to be larger areas, so sunlight doesn't come in from the outside edges as much as when you fragment something into smaller sections. Then you get a lot more sunlight that can penetrate from the outside in, and that changes the temperature levels of the soil, and all of those kinds of things are going to be a huge issue as well. Invasive species. So this one's actually a little bit different and not so much of an issue for us here yet. But in a large part of the country, feral pigs are a humongous issue. I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but they actually are really, really destructive, and they're literally, you know, wild pigs that are running around. They don't belong in the environments that they're in, and they do an incredible amount of damage as they run through an area. And oftentimes they tend to associate with wetland areas, and so that's incredibly destructive to the species that live there, including salamanders. So invasive plants, though, can also change the soil chemistry around them. And then there's also, this is one that probably does impact us in areas here a little bit more. There's invasive earthworms that actually consume the leaf layer in forests much more heavily than the native species that are there. And so that's going to impact the soil temperature, the composition of the invertebrates available for salamanders to eat, and largely, you know, drive them out of an area. There are two fungal diseases that have been introduced from other areas of the world that impact amphibians. One is not actually in the US now, one is, and those are the kinds of things that researchers are trying to get a handle on, trying to make sure that illegal trade of amphibians and other things that can introduce diseases like that don't, you know, continue, and trying to keep those things in check. And unfortunately, a few of the salamander species have shown high propensities to be impacted by these specific diseases. So there are things that could really easily decimate a population of salamanders if they got out of control in an area. And unfortunately, I don't really think there's much that we can do to keep it out. It's kind of like once it's here, like the spotted lanternfly. There's ways that we can make sure we're trying to limit exposure, you know, of the disease in areas, but that's why it's really important. And there's a lot of work on the outside, not something that we're involved with as an organization, but like, you know, to cut down on trade and bringing in species that might have this disease from outside of the United States. And then climate change and is a huge one. Hotter summers make it difficult for salamanders to find proper cover, and you add in the combination of fragmenting of our forests and changes in distribution and precipitation, you know, and all of that kind of stuff can have an impact on salamander populations. And then also along with this, there's a, you know, we are seeing this drop in insect abundance, and a lot of the things that salamanders eat are insects. In invertebrates in the forest floor. And so any kind of drop in insect abundance is going to ultimately impact the prey available to salamanders in a forested environment. So to that end, we are have a project, one of our citizen science projects, to look at salamanders in the watershed. What we are using right now is fallen natural boards from an American beech tree that fell in Camp Woods, and our conservation crew went out and cut what we call tree cookies for us to do this project. When we started, all the boards were labeled really nicely like this, and I'll show you what the boards look like now. All total, we have 50 boards at Camp Woods and 50 boards at Crossways Preserves. The monitors monitor their set of boards. Each monitor has 10 boards that they cover. So we have 5 sets of 10 in Camp Woods Preserve and 5 sets of 10 in Crossways Preserve. And they monitor from March to May and September to November. And when they go out to monitor, so this top left picture, this is what the boards look like now. We started this project in the spring of 2019. And so they've been out there for a year and a half now, and this is what they look like. And in fact, a few of them are actually breaking. We need to replace them. And that's a project that hopefully will happen after this season that we're in right now of monitoring is over, that by next spring we will have been able to replace the boards that need replacing. But basically, when folks go out to do this, they are measuring soil temperature, they're measuring soil moisture, they're documenting the species that they find, including non-salamanders. So if there's earthworms under the board, or slugs, or ants, spiders, snakes, anything like that, they identify those things as well on their data sheet. If they find salamanders, they carefully catch them, and each salamander gets individually stashed in a plastic bag, and then they get measured. So I'm sorry I had to do this myself, and it was a little difficult, but if you look at this picture up here in the right hand corner, these poles of PVC, this is our salamander measuring device. And the idea is you feed the plastic bag and through the slots there, and you pull it gently tight against the edge, and that helps the salamander to straighten out. For me to try to balance the salamander and the measuring device when I was taking this picture was not working very well. So the salamander is not as flat as I would like it to be, but we do 2 lengths on them. We do snout to vent and snout to end of tail. And the reason why we do snout to vent is because salamanders can lose their tails. And in fact, this is a salamander that probably lost its tail at some point and started regrowing it. And salamanders can actually regrow their tails. Apparently, they can also regrow other parts of their bodies, like eyes, and I think their legs as well. And so, and a few internal organs, oddly enough, from what I was reading. But basically, this is a defense mechanism for them. If threatened by a predator, they can drop their tail, it's called, and ideally that either startles the predator enough that they can break free and get away, or the predator's left holding the end of their tail and the salamander goes on about its life. When we try to collect salamanders for this study, we try to make sure that we collect them and pick them up as carefully as possible so that we don't cause them to drop their tails. But we have found some that clearly already have tails that are lost. And so you can imagine that that's why salamanders are usually given in a length from their snout to their vent, because they may or may not have their whole tail. And so that can dramatically change the size of the salamander, for sure. We recommend people gather like the whole leaf pile if they need to try to, and definitely not pick up a salamander by its tail. So that's one of the ways that we try to protect the salamanders as much as we possibly can. So they get weighed, they get measured, they get identified, and then we let them go back under their cover board. So you can see some of our volunteers here. This is a very family-friendly project. We have a lot of families with kids that are very much involved in doing this. And that was all I was going to say about that. Yes. Any relevant notes that they might find, like they found a salamander that was missing its tail or something like that. So our results to date are honestly kind of all over the place. As I said, we started this in the spring of 2019 as a part of the launch of the overall citizen science project that Wissahickon Trails was doing within the watershed. And just because of timing that year, the volunteers, in order to get everybody up to speed and trained and the boards out and all of that kind of thing, they only were able to monitor 3 periods in the spring of 2019 season. So typically in the spring season and the fall season, there's 6 monitoring periods each. And the way it works out for us is we assign 9-day periods. And so our monitors go out once during that 9-day period. And that the way it's set up is it gives them plenty of weekend time to be able to do it. But it helps us know that what we do is we just count all of the observations from that 9-day period as one, no matter when somebody went out. And it makes it easier than tracking individual dates that people went out. So we were only able to do the last 3 periods in the spring instead of all 6. In the fall, of 2019, we did all 6 periods, pretty much at all the cover boards, I think, were accounted for. And so we've got a pretty full set of data for the fall. And then we started the spring. This happened, the first period was the end of February. And then COVID happened. And so as an organization, we took the extraordinary precaution of telling volunteers that they were not required to go out and do their monitoring. And in fact, during a bunch of this periods was actually when we were supposed to be, shut down and locked in and not, only essential travel and that kind of things. And measuring for salamanders didn't really feel like it was essential enough to send people out. Some volunteers did continue to do that, so we got a little bit of data for the spring session of 2020, but clearly not a complete data set. And fall of 2020 is ongoing right now. The volunteers are back out in the field. They've done the first 2 periods and found no salamanders. But if you think back to about a month ago, when they would have started was when we were in our hottest and driest part of the late summer, so into September. And it was really hot and really dry and had been for a while. And as far as salamanders are concerned, they're going to stay deeper down and not come up under the cover boards. Right now, this past Saturday started the 3rd period, and comparably the 3rd period in the fall of 2019 was this giant gray bar here where we had 90 salamanders observed across all the cover boards. So I'm hopeful that when I start to see the data sheets from the period that they're monitoring for right now, we'll start to see that pick up. They're temperature dependent, so this is what we can do. What I have right now is not enough consistent data to start drawing any kind of conclusions at all. But ultimately, what we're trying to look at is trying to see if we have enough data to do some modeling around understanding the whole population of salamanders and population levels, if possible, although that may take a lot more data than we are capable of generating. But we are also, I would like to be able to start making some assessments of soil temperature and soil moisture versus number of salamanders and locations of boards and things like that. Right now, we don't even really have a complete enough data set to start. As you can see, it's kind of all over the place to start making those assessments, but that's kind of the goal. And then the other thing is right now, all of these salamanders are eastern redback salamanders. We found 1 northern red salamander at 1 coverboard site one monitoring period. That's it. So literally one salamander. And then one of our monitors also goes to Robbins Park, which is not one of our preserves, but is also along tributary to the creek, and so monitors there as well, and they're finding northern two-line salamanders there. And we know there's northern two-line salamanders on our preserves because we've found them in our surveys that were done about 4 or 5 years ago, so they should show up. It's possible, though, that where the boards are located for these studies are not close enough to the water sources to find those salamanders. So one of the things that we will be doing is expanding this beyond the 2 preserves that it's in to look at some of our other preserves and to look at some locations where we might pick up more of the semi-aquatic salamanders. So closer to the creek, closer to some of the tributaries, and not so much just in the woods, which is where they're set up now. The other thing that I've started to notice, and again, this is hard to do because of the data that we have, but we noticed in the spring of 2019, the salamander numbers that we got were relatively low. And so, you know, okay, that it's new. It takes them a while to find the boards. It could have been just there weren't enough, wasn't enough time. I'd have to go back and look at correlations to temperature and weather during that time period. But we also saw that same sort of drop off in the data that we do have from the spring of 2020, and looked like initially the first periods in March, in late February and early March, were showing a lot of salamanders, and saw that drop off again at the end of the spring season. And it's possible that we might need to, you know, shift the time a little bit more. I'd like to have another season's worth of data for the springtime that's complete to compare it. But it may be, you know, start like drawing those conclusions. Fall, it looks like we're kind of picking up the peaks. And so, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this period now. We've had a little bit of rain, temperatures got a little bit cooler, and so hopefully the monitors are finding salamanders now. So as I said, we're looking at expanding this. If you are interested in becoming a volunteer for this project, please let me know. I would ask you to do that through our website. On the Take Action tab, there's a volunteer section, and you can fill out a form that says get started, about, you know, giving us your information and saying you're interested in being a volunteer. And please be sure to mention the Salamander project in the comments section of that form so that I can put you on the right list. You know, keep you in mind for salamander sites as we expand, either on these 2 preserves or some of our other preserves moving forward. So this is all I have for this evening. So I'm happy to see if there's any questions. I'm not seeing any right off. I'll give you a second to sort of think if you have any more questions. A couple things, some upcoming events. As I mentioned, on October 20th is the Vernal Pools program. November 5th is all about backyard bird feeding and some citizen science projects that you can do over the winter, especially if you're feeding backyard birds. And then on December 19th, I will be doing the program All About Owls. And again, all registration for all those is on our website, just like this one was. So encourage you to go take a look, and hopefully you will join us for those. If you have any questions after the fact, something that hits you that you just really need to know the answer to, or something else comes up, please feel free to shoot me an email. And I would be happy to answer any questions. I'm not seeing any more questions from anybody now. So I think we're going to wrap it up there, and I thank you for joining us. And hopefully you learned something about salamanders, and hopefully maybe you are interested in being a volunteer and helping us monitor in the future. Thanks a lot for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you the next time. Have a good evening, everyone.